The Dreadnought had been dead for 6 days, and I was still mopping the same stretch of hallway I'd mopped for 10 years, because nobody had told me to stop, and nobody ever told me to do anything else. Her name was the Veteranor Ascendant, a kilometre of dark hull lying in the Velgath dockyard like something that had been alive once and wasn't anymore. I could see her through the gap in the hangar scaffolding every time I straightened up to wring my rag. No running lights. No hum in the deck plates. Just a long, cold shape with 40 of the Empire's best engineers crawling over her skin like ants on something too big to understand. Fleet Marshal Oren Tesk stood under her belly with his arms crossed, and his jaw set the way it got when he was about to say something he didn't want to say. I'd swabbed his flaws for 10 years. He had pale grey skin, a face built for command, and eyes that had never once landed on me long enough to recognize my own. 6 days, he said, to nobody and everybody. 6 days, and the finest minds in the fleet cannot tell me why she will not wake. A junior officer flinched. Marshal, the diagnostics show no fault. The drive core is sound. The conduits read clean. By every instrument we have, there is no reason for her to be dead. Then she is dead for a reason your instruments cannot see, Tesk said, which means we are about to scuttle a dreadnought because 40 men with engineering degrees are afraid to say they don't know. I kept mopping. It wasn't my business. It had never once been my business, not in 10 years, not the time the old quartermaster broke his fingers on a stuck hatch I could have freed with one good kick, not the time 3 captains argued for an hour about a leaking valve I could have named blind from the smell of it. I emptied trash. I scrubbed decks. I existed at the edge of every important room in this dockyard the way a chair exists, or a lamp. That was the morning the readout boards near the coolant trunk started flashing amber, and every engineer in the bay turned toward the noise like startled birds, and not one of them walked toward the actual intake grates. They walked toward the screens. I'd cleaned those grates with my own hands. 61 years old, and there wasn't a filter mesh in this dockyard I hadn't scraped crud out of at some point, because somebody has to, and that somebody had been me since before half these engineers were born. I set my mop against the bulkhead and walked over, because watching 40 men stare at numbers instead of metal was an itch I couldn't leave alone. Get back from there, a tech snapped at me, not looking, the way you'd say it to a stray dog. Just looking, I said. The intake grates sat low on the hull, easy to miss if you spent your life looking up at view screens instead of down at deck level. I crouched, the way my knees hated, and put my hand flat against the grill. Cold. No draw. No suction, not even a whisper of one, and that told me more than any screen ever could, because I'd felt 1,000 working grills breathe under my palm and this one wasn't breathing at all. I pulled the great latch. It groaned like it hadn't been opened in years, which made sense, because why would anyone open a janitor's panel on a warship? Behind it, a felted, matted wall of grey-black sludge, thick as a fist, packed into the coolant mesh so tight that light didn't pass through it. Years of fine particulate, fleet smoke residue, and ordinary hangar grime, baked and pressed flat by heat cycle after heat cycle until the mesh wasn't a filter anymore. It was a wall. Marshal, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, because I'd said true things in empty rooms my whole life and never once been heard, and some old, tired part of me had stopped expecting to be heard now. He didn't turn. Marshal, I said again, louder. He turned because everyone else had gone quiet first, startled that the woman with the mop had spoken in a tone meant to be answered. Your ship isn't dead, I said. She's choking. I held up the great latch, then turned it so the grey sludge caught the hangar light, thick and ugly and completely undeniable. A captain laughed, short and sharp. That's residue buildup. Cosmetic. It has no bearing on the coolant. It has every bearing, I said, because coolant doesn't run on what your screen says should be happening. It runs on whether the air can get through the mesh, and right now it can't, because nobody in 10 years thought to open a panel low enough to look like my job instead of yours. Nobody answered that. The hangar held the kind of silence that comes right before people decide whether to be embarrassed or angry. Tesk crossed the deck in 6 strides and crouched where I'd crouched, his pale hand hovering an inch from the grill the way mine had been, like he didn't quite believe it without touching it himself. This is the cause, he said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man recalculating 10 things at once. One of them, I said. There's 11 more grates just like it, probably worse, because this one's closest to the access hatch, which means it gets cleaned the most by accident. Cleaned, he repeated, and looked at me properly for what might have been the first time in 10 years, taking in the grey hair pulled back tight, the faded coveralls, the mop bucket still steaming gently against the far bulkhead. "You are the hangar custodian." "Mara," I said. "Mara Quill. I've swabbed this dockyard since before half these boys had their commissions." A long pause. Then, flatly, to the captain who'd laughed, "Get her a respirator and a scraper. Now." It took 4 hours. Not because it was complicated. God, it wasn't complicated. It was the least complicated thing I'd done all year, but because there were 12 grates, and most of them worse than the first, and nobody in that dockyard owned a tool built for scraping baked particulate out of a coolant mesh because nobody had ever imagined the problem could be that small. I had a tool, though. I'd had it for 30 years. A flat steel scraper with a tape handle, worn down on one edge from exactly this kind of work, because warships do not run on miracles, they run on grates that breathe, and somebody has to keep them breathing. The engineers stood around at first, arms crossed, the way men stand when they're watching someone else do the thing they were too proud to imagine doing themselves. By the third grate, 2 of the younger ones had knelt down beside me with rags of their own, because watching a 61-year-old woman do real work while you held a clipboard starts to feel like a worse and worse position to be in. I didn't make them feel small for it. I just handed one of them my spare rag and showed him the angle. Short strokes, work with the grain of the mesh, don't force it or you'll tear the weave, because that's the whole secret of every trade nobody respects. There isn't a trick. There's just doing the unglamorous thing carefully, over and over, until it's done right. By the 4th grate, Tesk himself was crouched on the deck in his Fleet Marshal's coat, sleeves rolled to the elbow, scraping sludge into a bucket with his bare hands because I'd run out of rags to hand around and he hadn't asked for one. 40 engineers, he said quietly, not looking up, and not one of them opened a panel low enough to be beneath them. "It's not that they're not smart," I said. "It's that they're trained to look at what the ship tells them on a screen. Nobody trained them to put a hand on the metal and just feel whether it's breathing. And you were trained for that." "Nobody trained me for anything," I said. "I just spent 30 years being the only person in any room willing to get down on the floor and look." He didn't answer that. But he didn't go back to standing, either. He stayed down on the deck beside me, sleeves black to the elbow, until the last grate was clear. The ship woke up at the 11th hour of that long day, and there was no fanfare to it, no swelling sound, nothing like what you'd expect from a kilometre of warship coming back to life. Just a low hum that started somewhere deep in her belly and rolled outward through the deck plates under our boots, a vibration you felt in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. Then the running lights came up along her spine, amber, then white, then a clean and steady blue, and 40 engineers who hadn't said a kind word to a janitor in a decade stood in a ring around a half-open coolant grate and watched a dead ship breathe. Nobody cheered. It was too quiet a thing for cheering. Tesk just stood, slow, his knees cracking the same as mine had, and looked down the long dark hull as the lights climbed her length one section at a time, like something waking from a very long sleep. 10 years, he said, to me, to the hangar, to nobody in particular. 10 years you have been in this dockyard, and I do not believe I ever asked your name until today. You knew it, I said. Most folks do, eventually. They just don't use it much. He turned then, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen on a superior officer in 10 years of swabbing their floors, not command, not the careful blankness men in his position wore like armor, but something closer to a kind of stunned, grateful regard, the look of a man recalculating exactly how much he hadn't been seeing. I am offering you a commission, he said. Chief of Fleet Maintenance, Dockyard-wide Authority, a rank befitting what you did today. Name your terms. The hangar had gone quiet enough to hear the new hum of the ship under it. 40 faces turned to me, waiting. I thought about it. Not the offer, the floor. The long stretch of hallway outside the engine bay, half-mopped, my bucket still sitting where I'd left it that morning a lifetime ago. I appreciate it, Marshal. I do, I said. But I've got a floor I didn't finish this morning, and a closet down on deck 4 with my name worn into the door from where I lean against it on break, and I'd rather keep both, if it's all the same to you. You would decline authority over this entire dockyard, he said, to keep mopping it. I'd decline a desk, I said, to keep doing the one thing I know I'm good at. There's no shame in that, Marshal. Somebody has to keep the grates breathing. Might as well be somebody who actually looks. He studied me a long moment, and then, slowly, like a man unused to the motion, he nodded, the same nod I'd seen him give visiting admirals, the kind of nod that meant he'd just decided to respect something he hadn't expected to. Then you'll have whatever rank you like attached to the job you already do, he said. And the next engineer who walks past a panel low enough to be beneath him answers to me. I picked my bucket back up. My knees ached the whole walk back to that unfinished stretch of hallway, the same ache they'd had for years, and the mop water had gone cold and grey exactly the way it always did by mid-afternoon, and none of that had changed at all. But somewhere behind me, a kilometre of warship breathed steady and clean for the first time in a week, because an old woman had finally been asked to put her hand on the metal instead of the screen, and for the first time in 10 years, when I walked past a row of officers in their hangar, every one of them looked up.